Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Now, Prime Minister of Pakistan Imran Khan addressed the nation tonight, and he said the BJP government and Prime Minister Modi, they follow an extremist Hindutva and dangerous RSS ideology that essentially believes that India only belongs to Hindus, that this ideology is based on terrorism, and the curfew and the atrocities that are raining down on the residents of Indian-occupied Kashmir for the past 22 days will not be hidden forever. Prime Minister Modi's imposed communication blackout will have to end. He also said that he will be the ambassador of Kashmir and continue to raise the issue with every world leader and embassies the world over, and that he would raise it again in his speech, which is due next month at the United Nations General Assembly. And he added to this that the world and its entire Muslim population were keenly watching and waiting what the UN would do next. The organization, the very organization that stands for human rights, will it deliver? He said the sole responsibility of what happens now is theirs, and not just to what happens to Indian-occupied Kashmiris, but also between what happens between India and Pakistan. Because as the false flag operations, he mentioned that India was planning and Pakistan is expecting India to carry out, while the army remains completely prepared, that it could lead to nuclear attack, and all of that, all the world would suffer. Now, meanwhile, Indian-occupied Kashmir has entered its 22nd day of curfew, with reports coming in of thousands detained and hundreds hurt in protests. Let's speak to our analysts, our guests, and hear on the events that have unfolded today around Indian-occupied Kashmir. I would first like to introduce Dr. Inshah Malik, an analyst joining us from Kabul. Thank you, Dr. Malik, for taking out the time. After you heard the details of what Prime Minister Imran Khan has said, especially regarding how the sole responsibility lies on the UN General Assembly and the world leaders, how do you feel as this development takes place also in the backdrop of US President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Modi's meeting?
Well, I think more than the rhetorical backing, what Kashmir also needs is a sort of a strong political will inside the Pakistani administration and any other, world leaders who would wish to actually play a proactive role in resolving the Kashmir issue. At this moment, what we are looking at is Indian-occupied Kashmir, which has been in conflict with the Indian state for more than 70 years. But on the international platform, we still don't see any political, representation of Kashmiris for themselves. And the more rhetorical statements will get, the less space there will be for actual politics to take place. Mm-hmm. And of course, the Modi government, with his kind of rhetoric, will try to turn the international atmosphere towards their favor rapidly. And what we need to do at this stage is to actually allow Kashmiris to speak for themselves, whether it is about granting them an observer status in the UN, mm-hmm. where they can actively defend their own case, because now it's not, the more it's kind of talked about in the bilateral way, it's gonna, push back on what Kashmiris have been able to cultivate politically so far.
Okay, but Dr. Inshah, when we're talking about not just the representation of Kashmiris, we also need to acknowledge here that there has been numerous UN resolutions passed that declare it being a disputed region. And so when India comes out and says this is a bilateral issue, it becomes a completely different conversation. But hold that thought. Let me also welcome another guest who's just joining us. We have Mr. Munir Akram, former ambassador, joining us from New York. Thank you, Ambassador. We were just discussing how Prime Minister Modi and US Donald Trump's statement comes out at a time where the 22nd day has been reached of a complete lockdown. What are your views on this?
Well, I think the world recognizes that it is a serious situation. And a very reluctant world has nevertheless expressed itself in many ways about this situation. The Secretary General of the United Nations, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, numerous international human rights organizations, the international media, they have all come out and expressed grave concern about the situation in occupied Kashmir. I think that this brings some measure of pressure on the Indian government. The fact that the President of the United States has said he is willing to mediate indicates that there is concern in the United States also about the situation. And the fact that India rejects such mediation is a negative for Indian diplomacy.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
as far as Pakistan is concerned, we have to keep and maintain the pressure. We have started the pressure in the UN Security Council.
Right.
We have to maintain the pressure in the Human Rights Council, in the UN General Assembly, and in other forums in order to make sure that the world remains aware of the situation, the grave situation of the Kashmiri people.
And that once again, the attention that Indian-occupied Kashmir and its residents deserve doesn't go in the backdrop here. I'd like to welcome another analyst joining us from Islamabad with us, Mr. Rasul Baksh Rais. Thank you, Mr. Rais, for speaking with us on Newswire, talking about, as we just heard from our guest, about more pressure needs to be applied here. When you hear about Prime Minister Modi meeting with US Donald Trump, and then he's coming out and saying that this is a bilateral issue. When Prime Minister Modi says all issues between India and Pakistan are bilateral in this nature, and I quote here, that is why we don't bother any other country regarding them. The fact that several UN resolutions have declared it a disputed region where the people of Kashmir will have the right to self-determination, how do you see this turn of events?
This statement is full of contradictions because the history of Kashmir's conflict and the issue being at the United Nations and people rising up against the Indian occupation and at the same time number of agreements that you have referred to between India and Pakistan, and not only agreements, but then were it a bilateral issue and not an issue of international concern, then why is it that Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru then took the problem to the United Nations? It was not Pakistan that took the issue to the United Nations, but India at that time. And since then, there has been a United Nations resolution on that. Mm-hmm. Yes, bilaterally, we have negotiated, tried to negotiate with India, and there are a number of instances where we entered into serious dialogue, but at the end we saw that India was quite reluctant to make any concessions to Pakistan or the people of Kashmir. Mm-hmm. So either bilaterally or through international mediation, right. The problem is there. The first thing that the situation in Kashmir reflects is that it is not an internal affair of India, and India cannot really hide behind the curtain of its national sovereignty. Okay. But rather it is an issue of human rights. It is an issue of importance to Pakistan. Okay. Because it is unfinished agenda of the partition.
Right. So history, you're talking about the history. It is one of those things where it cannot be ignored, can't be put aside. But at the same time, let me just ask you this, Mr. Mohammed Junaid, who's joining us from DC, talking about not just the history here, we're talking about within India, there is a lot of contention brewing in terms of what BJP has done, which Prime Minister Khan today in his speech also said was a major blunder. Now here, let me just quote a recent example of former president of the Indian Congress Party, Rahul Gandhi, who on Sunday was experiencing it firsthand, what he called the draconian administration and brute force unleashed on the Jammu and Kashmir people. So do you think that this is being seen in the West through Western media? Is it coming across?
Well, yes, I think that Congress itself is responsible for this, and I think their policy over all these years has not been significantly different from the current BJP policy. The second thing to note is that many of the people who have formerly supported the Indian occupation in Kashmir are themselves facing the brunt, including some Kashmiri political organizations. Their leaders are in jail. And what Mr. Gandhi is experiencing is not even a fraction of what everyday Kashmiris have to face in Kashmir. So, yes, I think, I think some people in India are realizing that India has almost fallen off the precipice when it comes to Hindutva politics. The second thing to note is, which I wanted to go back to your earlier question a little bit, India tells the world community that Kashmir is a bilateral dispute between India and Pakistan. To Pakistan, India says it's an internal matter, and to Kashmir, it says it's not a matter at all. So we need to get away from these talking points that India is continuously throwing. And we have to create an entirely new discourse which is based on the reality in Kashmir. We have to, as Inshah said in the beginning, we need to center Kashmiri voices. We need to give Kashmiris representation, because Kashmiris are the best representatives of their own case. I really appreciate what Prime Minister Imran Khan said when he said that he wants to be the ambassador of Kashmiris. We appreciate that, but also, let Kashmiris represent themselves.
That's a good point there. Hold on to that thought, Mr. Junaid. Let me come to you, Dr. He's highlighting something that you also have said, that the voice of Kashmiris needs to be heard at this point, considering the communication blackout does not even allow those who were pro-India to speak at this time. They're behind bars or they're in house arrest. A lot of them, we don't even know their whereabouts. We can only hope they're safe. And then when you hear Chairman of the All Parties Hurriyat Conference, Sayyid Ali Shah Gilani, come in, sort of appeal in his 5-point program of action, which includes not just Kashmiri diaspora and Pakistanis around the world, but the world to also take notice of what is happening. Do you feel like not enough is being done at this point, considering what has previously been done for Kashmiris?
Well, I think first of all, we need to understand that when I said that these are going to become, rhetorical at the international level, is because it works to the India's best interest to show, entire Muslim world is this one lump of, crazy Islamists or Islamic kind of terrorists. So we need to attack them. But here, what needs to be done is the proper education about Kashmir's political history and what Kashmiris have been doing for a long time needs to be brought out to the Muslim world. When I say Muslim world, quote unquote,
let me raise the point here, since we're running out of time. I really want to get the Ambassador Akram's point of view here. Also, you talk about political history. What of the current situation? It's the 22nd day. People could not in Kashmir even practice their very right of going to the mosque and observing a religious festival like Eid al-Azha. Doesn't this become a huge humanitarian crisis, the fact that nobody knows what is happening to those 8 million people?
Atrocity, and there's no question about it. What is happening in Kashmir is grave and serious. But at the same time, what we need to be careful about is that we do not let this, let India to paint it like a problem of Islamic terrorism. And that's why, beyond the rhetoric, beyond putting
we need to see beyond the rhetoric. Let me come to you, Ambassador. Let me just, Ambassador Akram, let me get your point of view on this. Is that a possibility right now that the West could be perceiving this, or the world leaders or the UNGC, everybody who is watching right now, what the world's supposedly largest democracy, how it is treating what it calls its own people? Is there a possibility of that perception coming across that Dr. Inshah is talking about?
Well, that perception has been created by India with the help of the Western media and some quarters in the Western world. We have to erode that image, and we are trying to do that through the various actions that Pakistan has taken. But I think the immediate problem is the crackdown and the clampdown in occupied Kashmir, which is a huge human rights and humanitarian issue, which Pakistan and all right-minded people need to draw the attention of the world community to. I think the whole issue of image and terrorism, etc., can be and should be dealt with on a longer-term basis. But right now, we have to focus on what the Indians are doing in occupied Kashmir, get a condemnation, and persuade the international community that this is an issue that needs to be resolved, because it could lead to genocide.
It could lead to genocide. I'm sorry I have to cut you there, Ambassador. I've got to introduce one more guest and get his point of view. We have former diplomat joining us, Mr. Shamshad Ahmad Khan. Very quickly, is the United Nations General Assembly going to do anything? I'm not going to even bother asking whether it has the power. Clearly, it is a heated debate. But considering the kind of attention the world is giving to Indian-occupied Kashmir, do you have any expectations from next month?
The
first you have to understand what the United Nations is all about. Well, it was created as mankind's last best hope. And today, after, let's say, 74 years, it is not even the lost best hope of mankind. So don't expect anything from the UNGA. In the first instance, I'm sure Munir must have already told you that the United Nations General Assembly does not take any decisions on issues of peace and security. Those issues are decided or discussed in the Security Council. So the UN General Assembly is only a global forum, a large global forum where the leaders of delegation assemble every year and vent out their views on different issues of interest to them. And so here is an opportunity for Imran Khan. He has already been loud and clear in his message to the world. And the world, for the first time in our history, is paying attention to what Imran Khan says. So he has an opportunity there now, because he will have only 15 to 20 minutes there to make his point. And I'm sure he will be, this time, he will not only be heard, but he will be listened to. He will be understood. And this time, the audience will not consist of the junior ranking officers of the permanent missions in New York.
Right.
It will be the ambassadors themselves, if not the heads of state, government,
right,
foreign ministers and ambassadors. So this will...
Okay. Thank you so much, Ambassador Khan. There, a crucial point he highlighted, a global forum where leaders of around the world meet to discuss world problems. And Prime Minister Khan will have this golden opportunity to not just be heard, but also listened to about Indian-occupied Kashmir. With that, we've got to take a quick short break. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back. I'm Ayza Omar and you're watching Newswire. Now, in a surprise visit, Iran's top diplomat, Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, has held talks with France's President Emmanuel Macron at the sidelines of the G7 summit. Now, he was invited by the French president, and it was taken as a bit of a surprise by all those involved. However, there was a delegation agreement from the US indicating that they were okay with the invite, something that the White House later denied. However, we will be looking into Javad Zarif's visit here in Biarritz in France, where the G7 summit was held. And we'll be talking to our analysts how they see the French president's move in terms of de-escalating tensions between US and Iran. First, I'd like to welcome our guest, Mr. Syed Mostafa Khoshcheshm, an analyst joining us from Tehran. And also we have Professor Kamel Hawwash, Middle East expert, joining us from Birmingham. Welcome to both of you to the show. I want to come to you, Mr. Mostafa Khoshcheshm, to just get your take on Foreign Minister Javad Zarif's visit to the G7 summit and how you see President Macron's move.
Hello, and thanks for having me. Well, very clearly, after the U.S. dropped the nuclear deal, the Europeans promised to make up for the U.S. withdrawal, and they promised Iran cooperation in 11 areas, in banking sector, in purchasing oil and sending the money back, in insurance industries, and so on and so forth. But they did nothing as long as Iran was practicing its, just patience for about a year or so. But as soon as Iran shifted the strategy, the Europeans started moves. They were encouraged, apparently, to do something to rescue the nuclear deal. And the equation changed, actually, after Iran tried to exercise a new strategy to reduce the costs that were incurred on Tehran and are still incurred on Tehran because of its unilateral compliance with the nuclear deal. Ever since then, there have been a number of states that have been trying to do some kind of mediation, though we do not look at them as mediators, because most of them, including the Japanese premier as well as Mr. Macron, they are more trying to advance the United States goals and objectives and an agenda rather than being a mediator. Anyway, there have been talks between Iran and French officials, especially Mr. Macron, in the last few weeks especially, and the two sides, the Iranian foreign minister and the French president, in their last meeting 3-4 days ago, when Zarif was in Paris and having had a meeting with the French president, they were to provide response to each other's proposals and demands with regard to what they could do to keep the nuclear deal alive. The Iranians have very clearly stated that the minimum thing that the Europeans need to do is to keep the nuclear deal alive is purchasing Iranian oil as much as Iran wants, not for any specific level, and giving the money back home, back to Iran. Now, one more thing, which seems to be very important, in this chaotic situation where Europe is seen like being in turmoil when Angela Merkel is ill and she is giving up, her career as a veteran politician, Europe needs a leader with the type of conditions we are witnessing in Britain, in Germany, and elsewhere. Mr. Macron has been trying hard in the last few years in order to introduce himself as the leader of the European Union. So,
and while these circumstances, we're going to get into the detail of the kind of European geopolitics that exists and the French diplomacy push that we are seeing time and again. But coming back to you, in getting you in part of this conversation, Mr. Kamel, you see the situation as it's evolving. Is this, again, Europe's and the co-signatories of the Iran nuclear deal once again failing to make any impact on the U.S. when it comes to the kind of sanctions that it's been clamping down on Iran over this nuclear deal?
I think the visit by Iran's foreign minister was particularly interesting, bearing in mind it coincided with the G7 meeting with Trump in town, who only recently placed sanctions on Zarif himself. So it's intriguing why Macron thought he'd invite him at this time. Maybe he was banking on a president who has acted irrationally, to tell him that Zarif is in town. Why don't you have a cup of coffee with him? I don't know. I mean, this is because.
But do you think Mr. Khoshcheshm's analysis on this, that maybe Europe is looking for a new leader and the French president is taking this opportunity to sort of solidify his position? And you've seen him making a lot of diplomatic moves recently, especially his recent press conference with UK's leader Boris Johnson, and then now this. And it's not the first time he's done this.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that with Merkel's illness, Macron is emerging as the de facto, if you like, leader of Europe. Yes, Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, visited both of them, but the chemistry, what seemed to be more effectively respect, what seemed to have been given to Macron, even though in our case, as the UK, Johnson thought he'd extracted a concession from Merkel in terms of trying to get a deal on the Brexit issue within 30 days. But I think de facto, Macron is acting in that capacity, even though, as I'm sure you and your listeners are aware, Europe isn't run by one leader. There is no president of Europe, who is one of the incumbent prime ministers or presidents. But clearly, both France, Germany, and up to now the UK were the three largest and most important countries. So with the UK leaving the EU, with Merkel unwell and a forthcoming change, Macron maybe saw that opportunity and decided to exercise some leadership in that gap.
Right. Okay. So, but Mr. Khoshcheshm, keeping this conversation going on, what could be the incentive behind this move, considering that France, including the rest of the co-signatories that were present at the G7 summit, have failed to so far protect Iran from the U.S. sanctions? Could the reports that are coming from various news agencies that the French president had been speaking to President Trump earlier and been urging him to offer some sort of relief to Iran, that is lifting of sanctions, allowing those oil sales that it stopped to China and India to go through?
Well, as a matter of fact, the view that's most prevalent here in Tehran is that we do not see much of a difference between Macron and the Europeans as well as the U.S. president. most people here, including experts, believe that they are playing a good cop, bad cop game with Iran. And that's why Iranians believe that after so many years that they've been in compliance with the nuclear deal undertaking in full, and they have received no merit. Now only actions speak, not actions speak louder than words, but only actions speak. What they are demanding is that the Europeans promise Tehran to do cooperation in 11 areas, but they've done nothing, zilch. Even they make promise again to provide Iran with some of those merits. Who is going to guarantee what they now are promising? Because the last time we have had a UN Security Council in support of the JCPOA, and they dropped their undertakings and they never complied with their obligations. And then most Iranians now are suspicious of the true intentions of the Europeans. Everyone believes that the Europeans just started making some moves in order to keep the nuclear deal alive or keep Iran under the nuclear deal. After Iran started reciprocal pressures and after Tehran started scaling down its undertakings under the nuclear deal, therefore that's Iran's weapon, this new strategy that also included reciprocating costs. If they took Iran's ship, they did the same. If they violated Iranian airspace, they shut down the U.S. drone. So Iran doesn't want to lose this, strategy. And I believe the Europeans and Americans.
But I'm sorry, we're running out of time, and I want to ask this question to you especially, is that President Trump wants to force Iran into talks. He wants to have Iran on the table to discuss this, but he wants the discussion to include ballistic missile programs. Now, from what you're stating is that Europe has continued to fail in trying to get US to come to a deal, to lessen the sanctions. But at the same time, the Foreign Minister Jawad Zarif did accept the invitation. He did show up. That should be indicative of a sort of cooperative stance from Iran, should it not?
That's his job as a diplomat. He should exhaust all diplomatic, ways and possibilities and opportunities in order to see if there could be this de-escalation and the problems could be resolved or not. Still, he has already stated that there will be a very cumbersome and hard task and days ahead. Here, the problem is that Iran has stressed it's not going to open negotiation
on the ballistic missiles. Okay, we're running out of time. Mr. Khoshcheshm, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I want to get Mr. Kamal's take on this also. Besides what France's interest is in these de-escalation talks, trying to get US and Iran to speak, how do you see Foreign Minister Jawad Zarif showing up at the sidelines of this G7 summit, where when President Trump was asked about his presence there, he replied saying no comment, which is something very rare from President Trump. What do you make of this, him showing up for this invitation to the G7 itself?
Yes, I think we must also remember that there have been tensions in the Arabian/Persian Gulf, which the Europeans have been very concerned about. The British tankers that are being held by Iran, and the Iranian tanker which was recently released from Gibraltar. So I don't think it's just the issue about the nuclear deal. I think what the Europeans are trying to do is to somehow keep the Iranians on board, to de-escalate, particularly on the Strait of Hormuz issue, because that impacts on the supply of oil directly to the European countries. But longer term, of course, they're very interested in what they see as containing Iran's nuclear capabilities. And on the table at the moment, there is nothing apart from that nuclear deal that was so hard won. So I believe that they're trying everything they can to maintain it. They're not really standing up to the U.S. and saying, you signed the deal like we did, we're going to implement it regardless. They are only sort of visually, as our colleague said, it's time for action, because visually they're saying they want to keep the deal, but Iran needs to see that deal is working for it in order for it to reciprocate. At the moment, it feels that it has to take action, and clearly Iran's decision to take action
by announcing it would start re-enrichment, has moved the Europeans to this. And the fact that they were all gathered in France for the G7 was an opportunity. And of course, Mr. Zarif did the right thing by attending, being available, talking, explaining Iran's position. I think he did the right thing. Trump, as I say, is irrational. Who knows what he will do even tomorrow?
Who knows what he will do tomorrow? Thank you so much. We've unfortunately run out of time here. I'd just like to thank our guests, their comments on the situation after the G7 summit, on the sidelines of which the foreign minister of Iran met with President Macron of France and other members. And with that, we'll take a quick short break. We'll be right back with more news. Welcome back. You're watching Newswire. Now, Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan will visit Moscow on Tuesday for a meeting with his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin. These are the confirmation reports we're hearing from the Turkish presidency as well as from the Kremlin. Now, this emergency meeting, it's coming just a few days after a Turkish convoy, a military convoy, was almost hit by air raids in the Syrian province of Idlib. However, I should mention here that before this happened, and even after the announcement that this emergency meeting will take place, Syrian forces backed by Russia have continued to make advances into the last rebel stronghold in Syria's northwest region that borders Turkey. Since April, Syria and Russia has increased military attacks in Idlib province, and according to the United Nations, over 500 civilians have been killed as a result. Now, tensions between Turkey and Russia are soaring ever since the September 2018 agreement on establishing the demilitarization zone in Idlib have essentially failed. So after the Turkish convoy that was crossing over to Syria from Turkey came under attack, since then, what we're seeing is a situation worsening because Syrian troops surrounded one of the 12 observation posts that Turkey has in Idlib. So this makes matters worse. In fact, the Turkish foreign minister even protested, saying Turkish troops would not leave the post. Now that both leaders have agreed to meet soon, what can we expect from this meeting? We will be discussing with our guests today. Let me introduce our guests who are from Istanbul today. Both are analysts. We have with us Michael Arnold and Navvar Saban. Thank you for taking out the time and speaking to us here. I want to start with you, Michael Arnold. If we could get to the crux of this here, the way the situation has boiled up recently, heated up recently, especially in the past 7 days. What do you make of this emergency meeting? What are you expecting for this to turn out as?
Since April, but specifically in the last couple of weeks, we could say the last 10 days, the escalation in Idlib, which has now directly, involved Turkish troops. They have a single observation point that's been surrounded. As you mentioned, their convoy was almost hit by an airstrike. In fact, the convoy was hit, but it just was Syrian rebel escorts that were casualties. I think it's hard to say at this point what we might expect to see out of it. Definitely, there'll be a reopening discussion of the Astana process, particularly the Sochi agreement, which is supposed to have Idlib as a demilitarized zone. But at this point, I think it's hard to say. We may see a possible renegotiation of the agreement to actually shift the borders of where that agreement may lie. That's a possibility. But beyond that, I think a lot of different options are on the table.
So when you say there are a lot of different options on the table, what exactly do you have in mind? What kind of options are available right now between Turkey and Russia?
Well, I think Turkey has a number of options, and each, of course, comes with its own set of risks and potential rewards. So one of those options is, of course, withdrawing from Murak, which is the observation point, which is surrounded by Syrian forces now. Now, as you mentioned, the Turkish Foreign Ministry and the presidential spokesperson has said there are no plans to withdraw Turkish forces from that area, and that they remain in contact with Russia about that. The risk of withdrawing from that checkpoint is that the very same thing could happen to other checkpoints in Idlib. There's nothing right now that is guaranteeing that the push of the Syrian regime, of course, backed by Russia, in this case, backed by Russian air power, will stop. Another potential option Turkey could do is increase substantially its support to rebel forces with the hope that they may be able to hold off advancing regime troops. Of course, they could decide to escalate with the regime itself, but I don't think that's a very likely option that's on the table right now.
All right. So, Mr. Saban, let's bring you in on this issue, but with a different angle here. Now, Turkey has obviously been very concerned about the refugee problem. In itself, it's hosting over 3 million refugees from Syria. And with this ongoing onslaught in Idlib, it's seeing thousands and thousands more coming through. But here, what I don't understand, and I hope you can shed some light here, this situation as it is developing with the US, with the Op Center on Syria safe zone now fully operational, how does this play into how this meeting in Moscow is going to take place?
About the like non-scheduled meeting, which is like a very close meeting in regard of the situation. The Turk not only worry about the fate of the 12 observation point. The main concern here is the civilian, which are like up to 3 million. They are not willing, or they will not be standing aside and watching a new wave of refugees coming to the north. So the only option they have right now is first of all, nothing is clear, just like your guest said. And the only option right now is to reintroduce a new deal from Astana. They don't have the luxury, even the Russian, they don't have the luxury to destroy Astana. Astana received a massive hit, but they don't have the luxury to destroy it. So eventually they have to come up with a negotiation with a new deal that secure these 3 million temporary in the remaining opposition area. But it seems like this is a very difficult situation, because the regime keep attacking different fronts, just like northern Latakia. There should be a solid solution for the ongoing ground attack from the Russian side.
Right, but you see the criticism from Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's government on this establishing of a safe zone between US and Turkey. He calls it a serious escalation that violates its sovereignty. Now, when this is the kind of situation, first also try and help us understand how Ankara's ambitions in Syria, how do they legally make sense here with US and Turkey establishing a safe zone on its own in a third country?
It's first of all, what's going on. There is 3 different files for the Turk, 3 different entity. It's very not clear or not accurate to connect all these files together. Like what's going on in Idlib is connected to what's going on to the eastern Euphrates, or in Manbij on Euphrates Shield, or in Afrin. All is different entity, different subject, different topics. They have different agreement, they have different negotiation terms at different partner. What's going on in the Eastern Front is between the US and the Turkish government. It's an ongoing deal with the US care about securing this border for the safety of the Turk, but also at the same time securing their local allies. The regime, he's giving statement about the situation, even about Idlib observation point, the Turks since the beginning. That nothing changed. I'm gonna say it in this easy way. No one will care about the statement from the Syrian regime. It's a relationship between the Syrian and the Turk about the safety of the Turk in the Euphrates Shield, in the Eastern Euphrates, and in Russia and the Turk in Idlib. It's the safety about the Astana future.
Okay, so let me ask Mr. Arnold this quickly, since we're running out of time. The situation, as Mr. Saban just spelled out for us, it is definitely complicated. It's not an easy understanding of what exactly is going on here. But could we see Turkey possibly using their relationship with the US as almost a leverage going in this meeting with Moscow? Because considering that the US backed the Syrian Democratic Force, which again is still wants to help maintain this safe zone, do you think this is possible?
It's possible, but that's very difficult to really say at this point. The reason for that is that the trust levels between Turkey and the United States, even with this latest announcement of joint patrols starting, the creation of a safe zone, from Turkey's perspective in particular, I mean, they signed the Manbij agreement and not much has been done on it. So they're very wary, although they want to have these agreements with the Americans, they're going to be very wary of what actually takes place. Should those relations go in a positive direction in Syria, of course, that could be used as potential leverage against Russia in this case. But the opposite of that is also true, is that the Russians can use Idlib as leverage against Turkey in hopes of disrupting potential Turkish-American rapprochement in Syria as well.
Okay, and Mr. Saban, very quickly, the situation as it is with Syrian forces in Morik surrounding this checkpost, this outpost of the Turkish military there, is it safe to say that the situation right now spells out more danger for the Turkish forces who were part of this agreement, who are also responsible for disarming the militants there in the region?
The Russians are trying as much as they can to secure the Turkish presence, at least to keep the Astana agreement going until the next meeting, official next meeting. So what's going on in the Morik, in the 9th observation point, there is some kind of Russian checkpoint around the Turkish observation point, at least to secure it. But talking about the future of the Astana, there is something very important asked from the Turk. They need to have a solution for the presence of some of the extremist groups like Haras al-Din, like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. They need to come up with a solution about the international road. Unless they don't have a solution for that, there will be always an excuse for the Russian and the regime to escalate their campaign to attack different fronts. So this is a very important matter. The Turk need to address this issue as soon as possible. Unless we will definitely see different new front opening in the north of the opposition area.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Saban there and Michael Arnold, both joining us from Istanbul. And with that, we've come to the end of today's program. We'll be seeing you tomorrow. Till then, goodbye.